The morning Earl Dunstan walked out to his pump house and heard nothing. The wheat was already 3 inches high across the South 40, and the cattle were moving toward the trough with the slow, confident expectation of animals that had never once been disappointed at that hour. It was the 14th of April, 1947. The air smelled like creek mud and new grass. Everything on the farm was exactly as it should have been, except for the silence inside that little wooden structure, where the half-horsepower electric motor should have been groaning, and the water should have been moving, and the day should have been starting the way every day started. Earl stood in the doorway for a moment. He was 51 years old, built like a fence post, with hands that had been calloused since he was 9 years old, and eyes that had developed, over 5 decades of reading Kansas weather, a particular quality of stillness that other men sometimes mistook for patience. It was not patience, it was calculation. Earl Dunstan was always calculating something: the angle of a cloud bank, the feel of soil temperature through the sole of a boot, the number of days of feed he had against the number of days until the grass came in strong enough to carry the herd. He was calculating now, standing in the doorway of the dead pump house, with the cattle shifting behind him and the creek running somewhere in the northeast corner of the property, and the sun just clearing the tree line to the east. He pulled the motor housing and looked inside. The windings were burned, not a tripped breaker, not a loose wire, burned black, finished. He set the housing back on the bench, wiped his hands on his dungarees, and walked back to the house. His wife Helen had coffee on the wood stove, the blue enamel pot that had been a wedding gift in 1922, and had survived everything since. Earl poured a cup and sat down at the kitchen table and did not say anything for a while. Helen set a plate of biscuits on the table and sat across from him, and also did not say anything, because after 25 years of marriage, she understood that the silence was not despair. It was thinking. The cattle needed water today. Not tomorrow, not at the end of the week. Today, and every day after that, through what was shaping up to be a dry spring and probably a drier summer. A new motor would take 2 weeks to arrive from the supplier in Wichita, possibly 3. The well was 60 feet deep, and the hand pump his father had used before the electric line came, in 1938 had been dismantled, and the iron sold for scrap during the war. He could haul water in the stock tank on the trailer, burning fuel every day, wearing out the truck, spending hours on a task that produced nothing except the basic maintenance of the herd he already had. Or he could do what his grandfather had done. Earl picked up a biscuit and broke it open and said out loud, but mostly to himself, that he thought the creek would support a ram. Helen looked up from her coffee. She had heard the word before, in the stories Earl's father told at the dinner table during the years when Earl and Helen were first married, and his father was still alive and still farming and still talking about the old days with the particular energy of a man who understood that the old days contained information the new days would eventually need. She did not know precisely what a hydraulic ram pump was, but she knew it had something to do with water and the creek, and a piece of iron her husband's grandfather had ordered from a catalogue in 1891, and she knew that when Earl said he thought something would work, the calculation was already most of the way done. She told him to eat his biscuit and figure it out. He ate his biscuit. He figured it out. What Earl was reaching back toward on that April morning in 1947 was a technology so old that most of the men at the feed store in town had never heard of it, and so effective that the ones who had used it had never wanted to give it up. The hydraulic ram pump, a device with no motor, no fuel requirement, no electrical connection, no moving parts beyond 2 valves and a spring. A device that used the energy of water falling downhill to push a portion of that same water uphill to wherever you needed it. Free water, continuous water. Water that arrived in your tank and your trough every hour of every day without anyone touching a switch or pulling a cord or writing a check to the power company. The principle behind it was discovered in France in the 1780s by a father and son named Montgolfier, the same family that built the first hot air balloon, which tells you something about the quality of mind that was operating in that household. The device they patented worked on a phenomenon called water hammer, which any farmer who had ever heard a pipe shudder when a valve slammed shut had already encountered without knowing its name. When water moving through a pipe is suddenly stopped, the momentum of that moving column of water has to go somewhere. It compresses. It creates a pressure spike powerful enough in the right conditions To force water through a valve and up an elevation, it could never have reached under ordinary flow conditions. The hydraulic ram took that phenomenon and made it repeat, automatically, indefinitely. Here is what happens inside a ram pump, in the plain language that Earl would have used explaining it to a neighbor over a fence rail. Water flows down a pipe from a source, a creek, a spring, any moving water with some elevation to give up. This pipe, called the drive pipe, feeds into the pump body, a cast iron chamber about the size of a small watermelon, bolted to a post in the creek bank. Inside that chamber, a valve called the waste valve hangs open. The water rushes through it and out into the creek, accelerating as it falls. Then the moving water reaches a speed where its own momentum slams the waste valve shut. That sudden stop, that water hammer, creates a pressure spike inside the chamber. The spike forces a second valve, the delivery valve, open for a fraction of a second, and a pulse of water shoots up into the delivery pipe. The delivery pipe runs uphill, as far as you need it to go, to a storage tank or a trough or a cistern. The pressure equalizes. The waste valve falls open again. The water in the drive pipe starts accelerating again, and the whole cycle repeats. 60 times a minute, 80 times a minute. Every minute of every hour of every day, as long as the creek runs. The waste valve discharge, the water that flies out through the waste port with every cycle, goes back into the creek. You are not consuming it. You are using its momentum and returning it. What you keep is the delivery, somewhere between 1/10 and 1/3 of the total flow that enters the drive pipe, depending on the installation, lifted to whatever elevation your delivery pipe can reach. On a farm with a good creek and a reasonable elevation difference between the water surface and your storage point, that fraction added up to thousands of gallons every day, delivered for free year after year, with no operating cost beyond the occasional replacement of a rubber valve washer. The device had been in commercial production in the United States since the 1850s. The Rife Hydraulic Engine Manufacturing Company out of Milburn, New Jersey, had been selling cast iron ram pump bodies since before the Civil War. The Deming Company catalog listed them in every edition from the 1870s onward. The United States Department of Agriculture had published installation bulletins as early as 1910. By the time Earl Dunston was born in 1896, the hydraulic ram pump was established farm technology across every part of the country where a creek or spring offered the necessary conditions, which meant the hill country of Tennessee and Kentucky, the Ozarks of Arkansas and Missouri, the limestone spring country of Kansas and Nebraska, the Piedmont of Virginia and the Carolinas, the rolling farmland of Pennsylvania and Ohio, where springs ran out of hillsides year-round, and farmers had been capturing them with ram pumps since before anyone still living could remember. Earl's grandfather, August Dunston, had been one of those farmers. August had homesteaded the Kansas property in the 1880s, coming out of Indiana with a Bible, a subscription to the Iowa Homestead Journal, and the practical intelligence of a man who had grown up understanding that survival was an engineering problem. The Dunston Quarter section had a limestone spring on the north end, where the ground lifted toward a low ridge before flattening into the big prairie sky. In 1891, August had ordered a 2-inch Rife ram from the catalog, $22 delivered by rail to the station in Salina, and installed it on that spring. He dug the drive pipe trench himself, 12 inches deep to protect it from frost, ran the delivery pipe 400 feet across open ground to a cypress storage tank on a wooden tower near the barn, and primed the pump on a morning in May of 1891. It ran until 1919, 28 years without stopping, through droughts and blizzards and the years when the cattle market collapsed and the wheat price fell and everything else on the farm was in crisis. The water kept coming. The tank stayed full. His wife kept her kitchen garden watered. His cattle never went thirsty. And when Earl's father, as a 14-year-old boy, had helped dig part of that delivery pipe trench in 1891, the experience had left a mark on him so deep that he talked about it for the rest of his life. The $22 pump, the 400 feet of pipe, the cypress tank on the wooden tower, the sound the pump made in the creek bank when you walked past it on a quiet morning. Chug-clunk, chug-clunk, chug-clunk. Earl had grown up with that sound in his memory, inherited second-hand from his father's stories, fixed there by repetition across dozens of winter evenings and Sunday afternoon conversations. He had never operated a hydraulic ram himself, but he understood the principle from the inside out, the way farm children absorbed practical knowledge, through proximity and repetition, through the unbroken chain of explanation that ran from the man who had built the thing to the boy who had watched it work to the grown man who still carried the memory. On the 15th of April, 1947, Earl Dunstan walked Garrison Creek. Garrison Creek ran along the northeast corner of his property, fed by springs in the low hills a mile north, and it ran year-round, not dramatic, not deep, but steady and cold and clear, the kind of creek that serious Kansas farmers valued more than bottomland because it never quit. Earl walked it from where it entered his property at the fence line to where it crossed under the county road at the south end, and he carried a hand level and a measuring rod and the seed corn envelope from the kitchen table with a pencil stub tucked behind his ear. He found his spot where the creek banked against a limestone outcrop near the northeast pasture corner. The water ran deep and fast there, 4 inches over the rock, cold enough to numb his hand when he dipped it in. He set up the hand level and measured the elevation change from that point downstream to the low ground where the creek flattened. 8 feet and 3 inches across roughly 260 yards of run. Then he turned uphill and measured from the creek surface to the ground level at the northwest corner of the barn lot, where he intended to set a storage tank on a platform, 15 feet of elevation gain from the pump location to the tank position. He sat down on the limestone outcrop and worked through the arithmetic on the seed corn envelope. Drive head of 8 feet. Delivery elevation of 15 feet. Friction loss in the drive pipe factored against pipe diameter and length. Expected delivery rate based on the relationship between drive head and delivery head that his father had described and that matched when Earl looked it up later that week in a 1917 Extension Service Bulletin he found in the bottom of his father's old farm box in the attic, the charts published by the Kansas State Agricultural College to the decimal point. The numbers said it would work. The numbers said he could deliver between 4 and 6 gallons per minute to the storage tank, which meant between 5,000 and 8,000 gallons every 24 hours, which meant a 900-gallon tank that refilled itself completely every 2 to 3 hours around the clock. More water than his cattle needed. More water than his household needed. More water than he had been pumping with the electric motor, at no cost except the work of building the installation. He folded the seed corn envelope and put it in his shirt pocket and stood up from the limestone and looked at the creek for another minute. The water ran past the outcrop with the particular quality of sound that cold limestone-fed water makes. Not a roar, not a trickle, something in between, unhurried and indifferent and permanent in the way that creeks feel permanent when you have known them your whole life. Then he walked back to the barn and started making a list. The first thing he built was the tank platform. He cut 8-inch cedar posts from the north windbreak, which was thinning anyway, and needed selective removal to stay healthy. And he set 4 of them in concrete footings at the northwest corner of the barn lot. He mixed the concrete himself from Portland cement and creek sand and gravel, tamping each footing in a hand-dug hole 18 inches deep and letting it cure for 4 days before framing the platform deck at 12 feet above ground. A 900-gallon galvanized steel tank arrived on a flatbed from a farm supply dealer in Abilene on the 3rd of May. Earl's neighbors, Harlan Briggs and Cleet Morehouse, came over that afternoon, and the 3 of them lifted it into position with block and tackle rigged from the loft beam of the barn, grunting and redirecting the load and arguing briefly about which direction to swing it before it settled onto the platform with a metallic boom that sent the horses in the near pasture trotting to the far fence. Harlan asked what Earl was filling it with, given that the electric pump was still on the bench in the pump house waiting for a motor. Earl told him about the ram pump, told him about the creek and the limestone outcrop, and the 8 feet of drive head and the delivery pipe he was going to run up the slope to the tank. Harlan listened with his arms crossed and his hat pushed back on his head, which was his posture when he was genuinely interested, but was not yet ready to say so. Cleet asked how much the pump body cost. Earl said he had ordered a Rife 1 1/2-inch model from a hardware dealer in Salina and was told it would cost $14 and take 2 weeks to arrive from a supplier in Kansas City. Cleet said $14 was a lot less than a new motor. Earl said that was correct. Harlan uncrossed his arms and looked toward the northeast pasture in the direction of the creek, and then back at the platform and tank, and said he had a spring on the hill ground at the north end of his property that had been running since before his father bought the place, and asked how much elevation you needed before the thing would work. Earl said 4 feet was the general minimum for a functional installation, and that the more head you had, the more efficiently the pump performed, but that farmers had run hydraulic rams on very modest drops with good results for a long time. Harlan pushed his hat back a little further and said he might come watch when Earl primed it. The pump body arrived on the 9th of May. The hardware dealer in Salina called Earl's neighbor 2 properties down, who had a telephone, and that neighbor drove over to tell Earl, which was how most farm communication worked in central Kansas in 1947. Earl drove into Salina and picked up the pump. The dealer's father, a white-haired man with large hands who had been called out from the back room because his son had never heard of a hydraulic ram, examined the Rife body with a look of recognition so plain it was almost nostalgic. Said he had sold them before the war. Said he had one on his own place years back before they drilled a well. Said it had never given him a day of trouble. Earl drove home with the pump body wrapped in burlap in the bed of the Ford and the installation sheet from the Rife Company on the seat beside him. He read the sheet that evening at the kitchen table while Helen washed the supper dishes, and he compared the charts against his seed corn envelope calculations, and everything matched to within the expected range of real-world variation. The next 2.5 weeks were the hardest labor of the installation. He and his son Robert dug the drive pipe trench by hand, 410 feet from the intake location at the limestone outcrop down to the pump site, 12 inches deep, through creek bank clay that pulled at the spade blade and limestone shelves that required a hand mattock to break out. They started at sunup and worked until the light failed, shirts soaked through by 8 in the morning, drinking water from the creek cupped in their hands, cold and clean, and tasting of the stone it had been running over since before either of them was born. Robert was 24 years old and had come back from the Pacific in 1945 with a particular quality of quietness that his parents had learned not to push against. He had been working alongside Earl for 2 years now, relearning the farm the way a man relearns a language he spoke in childhood, carefully with occasional hesitation, but with the deep structural knowledge intact underneath. He dug the trench without complaint and asked intelligent questions about the pipe sizing and the valve mechanics, and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone who intended to remember what he was being told. The drive pipe was 2-inch galvanized steel, threaded at every joint. Earl had been told by his father, who had watched his grandfather install the 1891 system, that a leaking drive pipe was the single most reliable way to kill a hydraulic ram installation. The water in that pipe had to be a solid column, no air gaps, no slow seeps at the threads, because the water hammer that drove the system depended on the incompressibility of a sealed water column. Compress air and it cushions the shock. The waste valve never slams hard enough. The delivery valve never opens. The pump cycles weakly or not at all. Every joint got oakum thread and pipe dope, and 2 full turns passed hand tight with the pipe wrench, and Earl checked each one by feel before they backfilled the trench. Robert watched him do this and did not ask why, because the explanation was already obvious from the care being taken. At the creek intake, Earl built a wooden box strainer from pine boards, a simple enclosure with a brass mesh screen on the face, sunk into the bank, so the screen sat 3 inches below the water surface, where the current was steady and the floating debris passed over without collecting. The strainer's job was to keep the drive pipe clean. A crawdad, a wad of water grass, a piece of bark, anything that found its way into the drive pipe and lodged against the waste valve would hold the valve open and silence the pump as completely as a dead motor. Earl told Robert to check the strainer every morning before breakfast and every evening before supper for the first month, until they understood how the creek behaved at this location and what it carried in different conditions. Robert said yes, sir, and meant it. The delivery pipe was 1-inch galvanized, running from the pump body up the long slope to the storage tank on its cedar platform. 460 feet of pipe, buried 6 inches down, crossing the northeast pasture in a straight line, that Earl had staked with wooden lath before they started digging, so that no one would forget where it ran. He was already thinking about the winter, about frozen ground, and the need to know exactly where to dig if a joint ever needed attention. On the evening of the 24th of May, 11 days after Earl had hoped to be finished, and 3 days after Robert had quietly stopped making any observation about the timeline, they made the final connection at the pump body, and Earl walked every foot of both pipe runs one more time, pressing his palm against the backfilled earth above each joint in the drive pipe, feeling for the slight dampness that would indicate a seep. He found one, at a coupling about 90 feet up the drive pipe run. He dug it out, tightened the coupling another full turn, repacked the pipe dope, and backfilled again. They primed it the next morning. Sunday, the 25th of May, 1947. Helen came out to the pasture fence without being asked. Harlan Briggs came, as he had said he might, and brought his wife and his 16-year-old boy, Dale, who stood with his hands in the pockets of his overalls and looked at the creek bank with the elaborate nonchalance of a teenager who is intensely curious and unwilling to show it. Cleet Morehouse sent word that he couldn't come but wanted to hear how it went. Earl opened the intake valve and let the drive pipe fill. You could not see the water moving through the buried pipe, but you could hear it. A low rushing sound that traveled up through the ground and became at the pump body a gurgle and then a hiss as the air inside the pipe was pushed ahead of the advancing water column and forced out through the open waste valve. Earl held the waste valve lever down, keeping the valve manually open, and they stood there in the May morning light, waiting for the air to clear. It took 4 minutes. Then the water running from the waste valve went from sputtering and grey-tinged to clear and full and steady. Earl looked at Robert. Robert gave a single nod. Earl released the lever. The waste valve slapped shut under the momentum of the moving water. The water hammer fired inside the cast-iron chamber, a sharp, definitive sound like a single knock on a wooden door. Then the waste valve fell open again, and the water rushed through, and the valve slapped shut again. And this time there was no gap between the first cycle and the second. The pump had found its rhythm. Chug-clunk, chug-clunk, chug-clunk. Dale Briggs pulled his hands out of his pockets. Harlan's wife put her hand on the top rail of the fence. Robert crouched down next to the pump body and watched the waste valve arc its pulse of water back into the creek with each cycle, regular as a clock, and his face did something that was not quite a smile but was in the neighborhood of one. Earl walked up the slope to the storage tank without saying anything. He stood underneath it and tilted his head and listened. For 2 minutes, there was nothing. Then 3 minutes. The delivery pipe was 460 feet long, and the water had to fill that entire column before anything reached the tank, and Earl was patient. He could be patient when he was certain of the outcome, and he was certain of this outcome. At just past 4 minutes, he heard it. A thin sound at first, barely audible, water striking the dry metal bottom of the tank, the way the first raindrops sound on a tin roof. Then more, then a steady drumming that rose in pitch as the water level climbed and the falling distance shortened. He stood there and listened to it for a moment. Then he walked back down to the creek. Harlan Briggs was standing close to the pump body now, watching it work with his arms at his sides, and an expression that Earl had seen on men's faces before when they encountered something that their understanding had told them was probably too simple to be real. And that was turning out to be exactly as simple and exactly as real as the man who built it had said it would be. Harlan told Earl he was going to go home and walk his North Hill and look at that spring. Earl told him he'd be glad to come over and run the numbers with him. Harlan said he might take him up on that. The pump ran through the rest of May and all of June and the dry, hard July that followed, when the pasture ponds in the county went to green-tinged mud, and farmers with electric pumps were watching their well levels with the specific anxiety that anyone who had lived through the 1930s carried in their bones like a mineral deposit. Earl's tank stayed full. The overflow pipe he had set at the top of the tank ran a small continuous stream into the cattle lot whenever the delivery exceeded demand, which was most of the time. His herd had more reliable water that summer than they had ever had under the electric pump, because the electric pump had required him to run it in cycles to manage the power bill. And the ram pump ran without interruption, and without cost and without any decision-making on his part at all. Helen's kitchen garden that summer was the best she had ever grown. Earl had run a gravity line from the base of the storage tank to a standpipe at the northeast corner of the garden. And Helen had a faucet she could open whenever the soil needed water, fed by a tank that never went empty. Tomatoes staked 4 feet high, sweet corn coming in 3 weeks ahead of her neighbors. Pole beans climbing twine strings tied to a wooden frame Earl had built against the south wall of the smokehouse, heavy enough that they pulled the strings taut by August. The county extension agent came by in late July on his regular rounds and stood in the garden for a while without saying much, and then asked Earl to explain the water system again slowly. Earl explained it slowly. The extension agent wrote things in a small notebook. He said he thought he might mention it in the fall newsletter, and he asked if Earl would mind. Earl said he didn't mind at all. That fall and the following year, 3 other farms in the county put in hydraulic ram installations. One of them was Harlan Briggs, who walked his North Hill spring and found 11 feet of elevation change between the spring box and the position he wanted a tank, and who ordered a 2-inch Rife pump on Earl's recommendation and installed it with his son Dale in October of 1947. The Briggs installation ran for 16 years before a drought year in 1963 finally reduced the spring flow below the minimum needed to drive the cycle. The others ran for varying periods, constrained by the hydrology of their individual properties. Not every installation succeeded. One farm east of the county road had a creek that looked adequate in April, when the farmer measured it, but dropped below useful flow by late June in dry years, which made the ram unreliable in exactly the season when reliability mattered most. That farmer went back to his electric pump after 2 seasons and told people the ram didn't work, which was not precisely true but was not precisely false either. The hydraulic ram worked on the terms the landscape offered. On some properties, those terms were generous. On others, they were not. Earl's terms were generous. Garrison Creek ran year-round without significant fluctuation because the springs feeding it were in limestone country, and limestone springs were among the most reliable water sources in the American landscape. Cold and steady, regardless of surface conditions, connected to aquifer systems deep enough to buffer through dry summers and hard winters. The creek ran the same in August as it ran in April, within a range narrow enough that the ram pump's performance barely varied across the seasons. Through the winter of 47 into 48, when the temperature in central Kansas dropped to 17 below zero for 11 days in January, and the creek froze along the edges and ice formed on the rocks at the intake, the pump kept cycling. Earl had packed straw bales around the intake box before Christmas and wrapped the exposed section of drive pipe at the creek bank with burlap and more straw, and the insulation was enough. The ground temperature, 12 inches down, never dropped to freezing, and the water in the drive pipe never stopped moving, and moving water does not freeze. And the pump beat through the January cold the same way it had beaten through the July heat. Steady, indifferent, patient. Chug-clunk, chug-clunk, chug-clunk. Robert checked the intake strainer every morning before breakfast and every evening before supper through that first winter, pulling out the occasional frozen leaf cluster or strand of watergrass, rinsing the screen, resetting the strainer box. By spring, he had a clear picture of how the creek behaved across all conditions, and he reduced his checks to once daily, then to a walk by every few days when conditions were stable. In 2 years of operation, he pulled the waste valve and replaced the rubber flap once, a 30-minute job that cost him 60 cents for the new washer at the hardware store in town. That was the total maintenance cost of the installation in 2 years of continuous operation, 60 cents. The electric motor that the ram pump had replaced had required a new set of capacitors in 1943 and a complete winding replacement in 1945, and it had burned out entirely in April of 47. Its total repair cost across 9 years of operation, not counting electricity, was more than $40. Its monthly operating cost in electricity averaged roughly $3 during the summer months when it ran hardest. Earl did not belabor this comparison to his neighbors. He was not a man who needed to be right out loud, but he was aware of the numbers in the private ledger he kept in his head. As all serious farmers kept private ledgers in their heads, and the numbers were not ambiguous. The hydraulic ram pump had been, as his grandfather August had once said about the original 1891 installation, the best money he had ever spent on the farm. August had said $22, too. Earl's version had cost $14 for the pump body, plus the pipe and hardware and cement, and the cedar posts from his own windbreak, and the labor of himself and his son, which he did not count because the work had been done on their own land for their own benefit, and that was simply what farming was. What the ram pump gave back was harder to quantify than the cost of a motor or an electric bill, because it operated in the register of security rather than simple expense. Security was what you felt in a dry summer when your tank was full and your neighbors were watching their wells. Security was what you felt during the ice storm in February of 1950, when the power lines went down for 4 days and every farm in the county with an electric pump either hauled water in a tank trailer or let their cattle go thirsty, or both. And Earl's cattle walked to the trough the same as they did every other day, because the pump in the creek bank did not require electricity, and ice storms did not affect creek flow, and the tank on the cedar platform held 900 gallons that refilled itself every 3 hours around the clock. Harlan Briggs drove over the second day of that ice storm on his tractor, which he ran on his own belt rather than the power lines, and stood at Earl's fence and looked at the cattle watering, and shook his head slowly with the expression of a man who is calculating what it would cost him to install a ram on his South Creek, the one with better year-round flow than the North Hill Spring, and wondering why he had not done it 3 years ago. Earl told him the offer still stood to come run the numbers. Harlan said he was going to take him up on it this time, and he did, and the South Creek installation went in that following April and ran for 11 years. The knowledge spread the way farm knowledge always spread in those years, not through publications or extension service campaigns, though those helped, but through the particular intimacy of neighbor watching neighbor, of men standing at fence lines and feed store counters and implement dealer waiting areas, looking at what was working on the farm across the road and asking the plain question of how it was done. Earl answered the question every time it was asked, walked anyone who wanted out to the creek to look at the installation, explained the drive pipe and the waste valve, and the delivery elevation and the arithmetic on the back of the envelope. He was not secretive and he was not modest. He had learned something useful, and he shared it the way his grandfather had shared it with his father, and his father had shared it with him freely and in detail, because that was what farmers did with knowledge that kept cattle alive and gardens watered and families solvent through the hard seasons. Some of those neighbors installed systems of their own. Some listened and nodded and went home and looked at their creeks and decided the topography wasn't right or the flow wasn't reliable enough, or they didn't want to dig the trench, which was the honest reason in more cases than anyone said out loud. The work was hard, the trench was long, the pipe was heavy. $14 for a pump body was not nothing in 1947, when corn was bringing less than $1.50 a bushel, and the margins on a 120-acre operation were thin enough that Earl kept his farm accounts in a composition notebook with a pencil because he couldn't afford to be wrong in ink. But for the farmers whose land offered the right conditions and who were willing to put in the work, the hydraulic ram pump delivered something that the 1940s and 1950s, for all their technological optimism, could not easily replicate: genuine independence from the systems that everyone else depended on. Independence from the power company, from the fuel supplier, from the motor repair shop with its 2-week wait and its $40 bill. The ram pump answered to the creek and to gravity and to nothing else, and the creek and gravity had been reliable in that part of Kansas since before anyone alive could remember, and showed no signs of becoming unreliable anytime soon. Earl ran the farm until 1963. In 16 years of operation, the hydraulic ram pump in the bank of Garrison Creek required 3 valve washer replacements, 1 section of replaced delivery pipe where a tractor had crossed the wrong line and cracked a joint, and the seasonal maintenance of the intake strainer that Robert had made his habit from the first week. No motors, no electrical repairs, no emergency calls to service companies on Saturday afternoons, no 3-day waits while the cattle shifted anxiously at the dry trough. Robert took over the farm when Earl and Helen moved to town in '63 into a small frame house on a quiet street with a city water connection and a bill that arrived in the mail every month. Earl paid it without complaint. He had run his farm on free water for 16 years, and he knew what that was worth. And the knowledge of its worth was something he carried into town with him, the same way he carried the arithmetic from the seed corn envelope, and the memory of the pump beating in the creek bank on the morning he primed it, and the sound of Helen's garden in August, heavy with tomatoes and corn and beans, all of it fed by water that cost nothing, and came from the hill and went uphill and kept coming. Robert ran the ram pump through the 1960s. He checked the strainer the way his father had taught him. He replaced the valve washers when the cycling rhythm started to vary, in a way that told an experienced ear that the seal was going soft. He showed his own son where the drive pipe ran under the pasture and explained why it had to be buried 12 inches deep, and why every joint had to be tight, and why the strainer had to be kept clean. His son listened and remembered, the same way Robert had listened and remembered. The same way Earl had listened and remembered what his father told him about the $22 pump that his grandfather had set in a limestone spring in Kansas in the spring of 1891. The chain of memory held, as it had always held in farm families, where the practical knowledge of one generation was the survival equipment of the next. In 1971, a spring storm brought a cottonwood down across Garrison Creek, 200 yards above the intake. The tree altered the channel enough to reduce the flow at the limestone outcrop below the minimum needed to drive the cycle reliably, and by midsummer, the pump was stuttering, cycling in bursts and then going silent for minutes at a time, which told Robert the drive head was insufficient for consistent operation. By that year, the REA had been running power lines across central Kansas for more than 3 decades. Electric pumps were universal, and the county well driller could sink a new well in a day and come back the following afternoon to set the pump. Robert drilled the well and put in the electric motor, and the pump in the creek bank went quiet for the first time in 24 years. He did not tear it out. He thought about it, did the brief calculation of the scrap iron value against the labor of removal, and left it where it was. It seemed wrong to remove it in the vague way that it seems wrong to tear down a structure that still works, that was built well and served its purpose without complaint, and simply no longer had a role to play. The iron body stayed bolted to its post in the bank. The drive pipe stayed buried in the clay. The intake strainer stayed submerged at the limestone outcrop, the brass mesh going slowly green. 21 years later, Robert's son walked out to Garrison Creek on a September afternoon in 1992 with his grandfather Earl's installation notes from the seed corn envelope. Helen had saved everything, as farm wives of that generation saved everything. And the envelope was in a cigar box with the farm's deed and some old photographs and a rife installation sheet from the 1920s. And he stood on the creek bank and looked at the pump body for a long time. He was 34 years old. He had been reading about sustainable water systems and watershed management and the recovering interest in gravity-fed water delivery that was beginning to surface in agricultural engineering circles and university extension publications and the early issues of small farm journals that were starting to appear in the 1990s. He had come out to the creek with a specific knowledge that his great-grandfather had built something on this bank that deserved a closer look. He cleaned the intake strainer. He replaced the waste valve washer with a new one. A hydraulic ram supplier in Pennsylvania was still manufacturing Rife-compatible parts and shipping them by mail order, because the knowledge had never entirely disappeared, only retreated to the margins where it waited patiently for anyone willing to look for it. He checked every accessible joint in the drive pipe for movement and tightened 2 couplings that had worked slightly loose in the years of disuse. He filled the drive pipe through the intake and held the waste valve lever open and waited for the air to clear. He primed it on the second attempt. The first attempt failed because air remained in the drive pipe at a joint near the creek bank where the pipe curved, and the cushion of air prevented the water hammer from developing full pressure. He bled the air out through a small port fitting Earl had installed at the bend, precisely for this purpose. A detail so characteristic of Earl's thinking, anticipating the problem before it occurred, and building the solution into the installation, that the great-grandson stood there for a moment just looking at the brass fitting before he understood what it was for. Then he primed it again. The waste valve cleared. He released the lever. The valve slapped shut. Chug-clunk, chug-clunk, chug-clunk. August Dunstan's iron and August Dunstan's principle and August Dunstan's $22 beating in the limestone bank of Garrison Creek 101 years after it was first installed, run by the hands of a great-grandson who had been born 47 years after the original priming and who stood in the September afternoon light, listening to the pump find its rhythm with an expression that was equal parts astonishment and recognition. recognition of something he had not personally experienced, but somehow, through the chain of memory that farm families maintained across generations, already knew. He watched the waste valve arc its pulse of water back into the creek for a few minutes. Then he walked up the slope to where the storage tank had once stood on its cedar platform, now long since removed. He would need to build a new one. He was already calculating the elevation, the pipe run, the tank size, the winter protection for the intake. He was doing arithmetic in his head the way his great-grandfather had done it on the back of a seed corn envelope, working through the numbers until the answer made sense. It made sense. It had always made sense. That was the thing about the hydraulic ram pump that the decades of electric infrastructure and powered convenience had obscured, but not erased. The sense it made was written into the landscape itself, into the relationship between water and gravity that predated every motor and every power line and every fuel delivery and every bill that arrived in the mail. The creek ran downhill. The principle was available. The iron had lasted a century. All that was ever required was someone willing to remember. Thank you so much for watching this all the way through. That means everything to us, and we mean it. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of a grandfather or a piece of land, or a way of understanding problems that the modern world has mostly set aside, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what we put out next. Share this with someone who would appreciate it. That is the single most powerful thing you can do to keep these stories alive. We have many more waiting, and we will see you in the next one. This video is inspired by true events, genuine historical practices, and documented agricultural history of rural America. It is not intended to represent or offend any individual, family, or community. Hurl Dunstan is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who relied on hydraulic ram pumps and similar gravity-fed water systems during the 1930s through the 1970s, and whose practical knowledge of these technologies was carried forward through the unbroken chain of family memory across generations.